A boy is lying on his back, on a wooden platform, in the middle of nothing. No engine, no compass, no coastline. Above him, the sky is doing something his ancestors trained him to notice, something almost everyone alive today has lost the ability to see. It is moving. Not the way clouds move, not the way a storm moves. The sky, to this boy, is a machine, and he has memorized its gears. Most people assume the ocean was crossed by accident, a drifting canoe, a lucky current, a desperate people pushed out to sea by hunger or war, hoping the water would be kind to them. That is not what happened. What happened is stranger. Centuries before instruments existed to measure a star's position, human beings built an entire discipline. Unwritten, uninstrumented, and almost invisible to history, that allowed them to cross open ocean with the same confidence a modern pilot trusts a satellite. They did it using their own bodies as the instrument, and the sky was not a backdrop, it was a map. For a long time, historians believed something simple and comforting, that early Pacific voyagers were castaways, people blown off course, people who got lucky. The theory even had a name: accidental drift. It suggested that the greatest ocean migration in human history, the settlement of an area covering more than 10,000 islands across nearly a third of the Earth's surface, was essentially a series of shipwrecks that happened to work out. The problem is, the math doesn't survive contact with reality. Drift voyages don't produce return trips. They don't produce trade routes. They don't produce the same islands being found, left, and found again, generation after generation, with people bringing exactly what they needed: pigs, taro, breadfruit, women, tools, as if they had known precisely where they were going before they left. In the 1960s and 70s, a small group of researchers began to suspect the old theory was not just incomplete. It was almost the opposite of true. In 1976, a voyaging canoe called the Hōkūleʻa left Hawaii, heading for Tahiti. No compass on board, no sextant, no GPS, because GPS did not yet exist for civilians. At the helm was a navigator named Mau Piailug, a man from a tiny island called Satawal, where this knowledge had survived, barely, passed down through a lineage that Western science had assumed was extinct. Piailug didn't look at instruments. He looked at the horizon, and he never stopped looking. He had memorized the rising and setting points of more than 30 stars. Not their names as decoration, their positions as directional certainties. Each star, as it rises, appears at almost the same point on the horizon every single time, night after night, year after year. Polynesian navigators built a mental compass out of this fact, dividing the horizon into hidden segments, each one owned by a specific star at the moment of its rising or setting. When one star climbed too high in the sky to be useful, another was already waiting to rise and take its place. The sky did not stop being a map when a single star disappeared. It simply changed hands. Here is where the discomfort begins. This was not memorization the way a student memorizes a textbook. The knowledge was stored differently, in rhythm, in repetition, in physical sensation. Navigators memorized ocean swells not as an idea, but as something felt through the hull of the canoe, transmitted up through their own bodies while lying down, eyes closed, in total darkness. A trained navigator could tell you which direction a swell was coming from without seeing it, without instruments, sometimes without being fully awake. The body itself had become a sensor. Researchers studying this later were unsettled by how literal this was. Wave patterns bend and refract around islands long before the island is visible, sometimes hundreds of kilometers before. A trained navigator could detect the presence of land, invisible over the horizon, purely from the way the ocean moved differently beneath the canoe. This means something quietly enormous. Long before radar, before sonar, before any instrument humans built to detect the unseen, the human nervous system had already been trained to do it, not through evolution, through discipline. It is tempting to romanticize this, to treat it as folklore, as ancient wisdom, as something warm and mystical. The reality is closer to something harder to sit with. This knowledge could kill you if it was wrong. A single degree of directional error, held constant across a voyage of 2,000 kilometers, does not produce a slightly missed target. It produces open ocean. It produces starvation, it produces silence, and then nothing. Every navigator who ever memorized the rising point of a star was also, without saying it aloud, accepting responsibility for every life on board. There was no redundancy, no backup system, no second opinion from another instrument. There was one person's internal model of the universe, tested against the vastness of the Pacific with no possibility of a partial failure. You were right, or you were gone. And so the knowledge was never casual. It was sacred in the way that only mortally serious things become sacred. Through fear, refined over centuries into precision. Here is where the story stops being about boats, because what these navigators had built, without metal, without writing, without instruments, was a working cognitive model of an astronomical system, accurate enough to move human populations across a third of the planet. They achieved something that looks, from a distance, almost identical to what modern celestial navigation systems do. Except they did it inside a human skull, transmitted only through memory, chant, and apprenticeship. A system so fragile that it could be extinguished within a single generation if the chain of teaching broke. And in most places, it did break. Colonization did not just take land. It interrupted knowledge transmission mid-sentence. In cultures where knowledge had no written backup, when a master navigator died without finishing the training of a student, entire libraries of astronomical observation vanished. Not burned, not stolen, simply unspoken. There is no way to know how much was lost this way. Not just in the Pacific, in navigational traditions across the Arabian Sea, the Indian Ocean, the North Atlantic, wherever oral transmission was the only backup system a civilization had. We tend to think of extinction as something that happens to species. It also happens to ways of perceiving the sky. Consider for a moment what this reveals about the assumptions built into modern life. We now navigate the world using systems we do not understand and cannot personally verify. A phone tells us where we are, and we trust it completely, without any internal model of why it should be trusted. The ancient navigator trusted nothing external. Every reading, every judgment, every course correction lived inside a single human mind, built through years of discipline, tested against consequences that were immediate and absolute. It is difficult, looking at this, not to feel a small, specific kind of vertigo. Not nostalgia, not admiration exactly. Something closer to recognition. The uneasy sense that human beings once carried entire functioning universes inside their heads, and that we have since outsourced that capacity to devices we do not build, do not repair, and could not replace if they disappeared. The stars did not become less reliable. We simply stopped needing to know them. Mau Piailug died in 2010. Before he did, he spent years deliberately teaching what he knew to students outside his own bloodline. An act that had once been almost unthinkable in a tradition built on closely guarded, family-held knowledge. He seemed to understand something the rest of us arrived at more slowly. That knowledge held only in memory is never actually safe. That a map carried entirely inside a human mind disappears the moment that mind stops being replaced by another. Somewhere above every one of us, right now, the same stars are rising in the same places they rose for him. Indifferent, exact, unchanged. They are still willing to be read. Almost no one still knows how to read them. And that gap between what the sky is still offering and what we have quietly forgotten how to receive may be the truest measurement of what it means to lose a way of seeing. Not the sky going dark, us closing our eyes.